How do we as Christians combat the loss of virtue in our society that threatens our faith and ultimately our very freedom itself? We'll talk about that tonight, so please stay with us. Thank you very much, and welcome. I'm Father Mitch, and welcome to EWTN Live, which is our chance to bring you guests from all over the world. Our guest tonight is a distinguished philosopher of science and a teacher. He's also one of my fellow Jesuits and a good friend. He's the president of the Magis Center for Reason and Faith. He's also the president of the Napa Institute. He's here at the network this week taping a new television series called Virtue, Freedom, and Faith. And tonight, he'll share with us how we can hold on to and strengthen all three of those things. So please welcome Father Robert Spitzer of the Society of Jesus.
Thank you, Mitch.
Well, just so some of your behavior might seem a little odd, even to our audience, just to let them know that you don't see that well. So that's going to be something that we'll try to compensate. But talk, you do. like any other good Jesuit, you know what you're talking about and you know how to place it. You're doing this new series on virtue, freedom, and faith. Why did you choose the issue of virtue?
Well, I think, virtue is pretty much suffering some severe blows right now in the culture.
In what ways? What would be some concrete examples?
Just, for example, among young people, a lot of them really don't understand that virtue is something beautiful. Virtue is a protection. Virtue is kind of a light that will really help the Holy Spirit to work through them. It's something very positive, but instead they have a very negative view of virtue as like rules imposed by people from above or rules imposed by the church.
And, rules imposed by old guys.
That's right. And in the imposition, there's a loss of freedom and kind of a resistance, to virtue. And of course, that marks a real cultural decline because, when you just think about it, you go back 100 years or even go back 2,000 years, the view of virtue was very different. It was viewed as something positive. I mean, Plato 2,400 years ago was saying things like, gee, the only thing that really matters in a person is whether he's just or not just, and all the other kinds of talents, intellect, creativity, that all sort of adds on to it and allows that just person to do something within the society. But the key factor is, gosh, if they're not just in the first place, they're going to be destructive instead of constructive. And furthermore, they're going to lead people into darkness instead of into light. And furthermore, they themselves will be in darkness. I don't think our young people understand that without virtue, they're likely to be in darkness. And the darkness is not just painful from the salvific side.
There are a couple things to keep in mind. On one hand, the founders of our country, when they were writing the Constitution in particular, emphasized that the only way that our Constitution works is if the people are virtuous.
That's correct.
And they also said that virtue will be derived from their religion. And they added some very important points. That if you don't have a people that is virtuous in its way of acting, then you will have to increase the number of laws to cover every infraction they come up with.
That's really true. And in political philosophy, there's two major branches of thought. One branch is like our founding fathers, which holds that you really don't need a lot of exterior structures and laws and enforcement mechanisms from the outside, because people in their own virtue will know what to do. But of course, there's a whole other branch. It's called Machiavellian, after Niccolo Machiavelli, which basically says human beings are pretty much evil, and because of that, you're always going to have to keep them regulated. And the only way of doing that is you either have to have a strong prince or a strong government or somebody do it from outside.
Now, wasn't Machiavelli actually doing a lot of personal projection of his own personality onto everybody else?
No question. And he also, by defending the prince and the prince's power in this way, could make himself a very fine living.
Yes.
So, it was kind of a two-edged but Machiavellian sword, because of course that, adjective now is very pejorative, right? I mean, it's very poor. You don't want it applied to you.
Yeah, and he was somebody who, toward the end of his life, was living very unvirtuous, a lot of vice.
Yeah.
And finally got caught and jailed. And so he said, I'll be good now. But he lived that out. But that's very different than the attitude of the founders of our nation.
Yeah, very different from Jesus Christ, very different from St. Paul, who said, everybody has a conscience, Christian, Jewish, or otherwise, that helps them to be regulated. And, he even talks about, how the Gentiles themselves, do well by God, by just listening to the law that's written in their hearts. But here's the problem. Even though God has written the law in our hearts, and even though we have this remarkably positive power of conscience, if you don't listen to it, if you think it's a fiction, if you think that virtue is merely a rule imposed on you from some structure from without, if you basically are running from virtue and you feel, that conscience is I don't know what it is, you might say to yourself, but it's certainly not like, seeing something that's in front of you. But when you look at Jesus or you look at St. Paul, frankly, if you look at Plato and Aristotle, these are people who said, gee, conscience is telling us dictates that are more obvious. In fact, for Immanuel Kant and John Henry Newman, they grounded proofs for God's existence on the data of conscience because they thought it was so obvious. Yet we live in a culture where the sense of conscience, the sense of the positivity of virtue is so severely diminished that, quite frankly, people are slipping into less than utilitarian, less than Machiavellian ways, and thinking they're doing the good for themselves and others. But of course, there's destruction for themselves and others on the horizon, a real darkness on the horizon.
One of the characters in our culture, our popular culture, who really was a tool and a promoter of the deadening of conscience, was a television talk show host who warned that the worst thing you could do is have guilt feelings.
Yeah.
If you felt guilty, that was terrible. Not the things you did to other people that made you feel guilty, but his catechism at the end of his very, in my opinion, sleazy program was to say, well, look, just accept what everybody else does. Don't judge them. Don't make them feel guilty. And you don't feel guilty, then everybody be happy. That is a process of making the conscience only emotional and then deadening it. Stifling it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you've got a lot of people who have actively tried to kill conscience and culture But one huge group, has basically, reduced conscience to nothing more than a Freudian superego or some kind of, teaching that comes from, parents and school teachers. There's nothing really of God in it. It's nice. It's from your parents. If you respect your parents, you may want to listen to your superego. But it's not like God is speaking to you through conscience, that he's given you this sense of real nobility when you follow the ways of justice, or a sense of real self-alienation and guilt and darkness when you're following a way of sin, but or even evil, in the classical sense of the word. And when that happens, and you see nothing of God in it, of course people are not going to adhere to conscience nearly as firmly. And furthermore, if you think that conscience has nothing to offer, you're not going to follow conscience. And there are a lot of people who've actively done this using psychology, basically saying, from a psychoanalytic point of view, guilt is bad. But guilt is not bad. Guilt has made us very civilized. Guilt has made us, in some sense, respect people. Guilt has enabled us to see with clarity the beauty of not only the golden rule, but the silver rule, ethical minimalism, right? Do not do unto others what you would not have them do unto you. Guilt has been exceedingly good for culture, civilization, individual human beings, families. It prevents us from doing the worst imaginable things, and frankly, when we do the worst imaginable things, to at least seek some kind of restitution, reconciliation for what we have done.
In fact,
it's scrupulous guilt that's bad, and the failure to make the distinction is problematic.
And one of the, I would say, a bigger problem than, say, scrupulous guilt or guilt that is emotionally crippling. There is a certain, St. Paul distinguishes in 2 Corinthians 7 between an emotional guilt and a guilt that is authentically related to bad behavior.
Yeah, exactly.
But what you have is a far bigger problem than the effects of guilt are sociopaths who are defined as people that
Without a
feel
conscience.
no conscience at all.
That's correct.
These are the mass murderers.
That's correct.
These are the ones. And the response in our culture is, well, legislate for everybody else, because we don't have a basis for stopping the sociopath from acting sociopathically.
No, I agree. I mean, it's a completely inverted logic. Black has become white and white has become black. You're trying to get rid of conscience, but if you get rid of conscience, what's left? You're just going to have to legislate more and more, as you've already pointed out, and even the legislation will take place without conscience, which means that too will, in the end, just be really done for perfunctory reasons.
Well, you see this with our politicians who so often legislate in order to acquire more power.
Yep.
And not because they're really helping virtue.
Precisely, precisely. I mean, it's in their self-interest to do so. Yeah.
You see how on one hand, they'll legislate that almost anything sexual is acceptable under the law. And now, even when federal law says that the sale of drugs is illegal, the federal government says, well, we won't enforce it in some states.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
And so, and they allow people to have thrills, but they don't encourage them to virtue.
Yeah,
And this is the problem.
And there it is. And so you just say, okay, you make a very sexually permissive culture, and then you wonder why. Hey, why are the number of rapes really going up? And why can we expect that 1 out of every 6 girls on a campus will either be touched by date rape or be date raped themselves? Or why is all this trafficking going on? I mean, trafficking in children.
In children.
So sexual activity.
You got to let people know what we mean by that children are being sold into brothels throughout these United States right now.
Yeah, and it's increasing dramatically. And people wonder, gee, I know that pornography could have nothing to do with that. I know that the sexual permissiveness of the culture could have nothing to do with it. It is curious indeed how all this could be happening right in front of our eyes. Terrible things like rape and the sexual trafficking of children and so forth. But I just can't put it together, cause and effect.
Well,
Yeah.
I think that you're just being silly. You know that it goes together.
Of course it goes together.
And also that in 50 years, we've gone from having 5% of children born out of wedlock to 43% of children being born out of wedlock in the United States today. Again, and to say, well, this is just about me. No, it's about these children.
Precisely.
The ones you abort, the ones that you have and neglect, the ones that you allow to be sold into slavery, these 45,000 children who are coming across the border. I will bet that 90% or more are born out of wedlock and are abandoned. I will bet you that's what's going on, and that if we don't step in, they will be trafficked in brothels as well.
Oh, to my mind, I mean, all these various negative, cultural consequences go right back to the loss of virtue. If people don't get it, if people don't listen to their conscience, if they don't return in some sense to the moral teaching of their religion, rather than to try and undercut the moral teaching of their religion or the moral authority of their religion or their religion itself, if we don't start using, we basically have about 4 or 5 real good, solid bases for morality that used to be around and accessible to everyone. Obviously religion was a huge one. Conscience is a huge one. The whole sense of virtuous people as an example is a huge one, or virtuous stories, right? Like the Aeneid, and Virgil's purpose there is to convey virtue, right? Well, if you start undercutting all of these things, and then you undercut virtue itself, for all intents and purposes, saying it's just a bunch of rules imposed, you can just abandon them at will. It's like that scene out of Thomas More, out of St. Thomas More,
Man for All Seasons.
Man for All Seasons, saying, oh, you're going to take out all the laws, are you? And then when the devil turns around and you've cut them all down and faces you head on, where will you hide behind? What will you hide behind? And of course, it's precisely that we've undercut the intrinsic sense of decency, the intrinsic sense of virtue, the intrinsic sense, of all the things that move us through our religion and through our conscience and through the wisdom and the example of really virtuous people. We've undercut it all. We become, cynics about virtue. And we as Catholics, we better start helping our culture out to restore it again by using the sources that we are given in our tradition, and they're immense. We use classical sources as well as the Christian sources. We are the masters of conscience. And how conscience operates, and we are, such good articulators of the teaching of Jesus. In the sense of articulating what his notion of love means and the unconditional love of God means. If we do not do this, we're going to, be subject to the old prophecy of Edmund Burke. All that's required for evil to triumph is for a few good people to remain silent, and we can't remain silent. We're going to have to try and find a way. In fact, I think I have a way, and that's why I was down here making that series. Yeah.
Because if you just keep complaining about how bad it was now, and then you sound like just one of these old guys who misses the good old days. So what do you want us to do?
I think we have to do a kind of a program. If I were the devil and I really wanted to undermine virtue, I'd do it with a 6-fold program. the first thing I'd do is I'd undermine the notion of happiness, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Then I'd go around and I'd undermine the notion of human transcendence, that you have a soul, that you're destined for eternity, that you have the promise of the resurrection of Jesus. Then I would undermine the whole idea that there's really a devil at all. In fact, if I were the devil, I'd deny my own existence and deny the spiritual struggle between good and evil. Then I go to the fourth step in the program and undermine the notion of freedom. Turn it from freedom for into freedom from. Make commitment and virtue really evil, and make, freedom from all commitments and virtues to be really great. It's going to be the fulfillment of my life. I can really be independent and autonomous now. And then I go to the fifth step in the program and I undermine the whole notion of love and eros, particularly romantic love, so I could really superficialize it and make people think that sexuality was an end in itself, that it never has to be in respect, to care for and care about another human being. It never has to be in regard to strengthening the bond between them, common cause, etc. Just gratify yourself. That's the principal thing. Get that feeling of being loved. That's what really matters. That's what freedom is. That's what we're all about. That's really true human fulfillment. And of course, it's utterly superficial, and I've just completely undermined the notion of love. And of course, then I would go after virtue itself. I'd start saying things like you've already said, conscience is just a myth. And by the way, it's negative and destructive because guilt is all around you. And furthermore, all moral claims are merely subjective. It's just opinions. Everybody has one. And of course, you can go on and on. If I were the devil, I'd finally get to the point where I'd probably point out, hey, and when all is said and done, virtue itself is a myth. Checkmate. It's done. So how do we undo it? We got to go right back and undo what he has done. Every single propedeutic element, he's laid the groundwork very nicely. So we're going to have to restore the notion of happiness. But we've got a way to do it as Catholics. And I have a system called 4 levels of happiness, which I use, which I think is capable of bringing kids by their, not just kids, our adults, people in our society, bringing them back to a much more profound view of happiness, not one that is utterly superficial. And then we have to get back to the notion of human transcendence. We use, near-death experiences that come from, good, profound studies in medical journals and things. But we also talk about the natural religious instinct, right, that would be found, for example, in good sociological works and psychological works, as well as, mystical writers in our own tradition, Rudolf Otto, Mircea Eliade, as well, and try to show, human beings absolutely have a natural, why is 84% of the world religious today? And by the way, just about 100 years ago, 100% of the world was religious. And why is it, according to the American Psychiatric Association, that people who don't have religion or are completely religiously disaffiliated, why is it that they have much higher suicide rates? Why is it that they are more aggressive? Why are they more distant from their families? Why do they have more drug problems? Why?
And they don't have children.
Exactly.
Because basically atheists are parasites. They don't have their own babies, and they just try to get everybody else's babies to become atheists, but they don't do it themselves.
Yeah. For all intents and purposes, we got to redress it, and we can redress it. We've got so much data about human transcendence. Just the 5 transcendental desires of Plato, that each of us have, the desire for perfect and unconditional truth, love, goodness, beauty, and home, right? When we have these things in us, and you have to ask yourself, what's the source of that? Animals don't have that. When animals run out of biological opportunities and dangers, right? So when you stop petting the dog, it's a biological opportunity of affection. You stop feeding the dog, another biological opportunity being fed. You stop threatening the dog, no more biological dangers. The dog falls out of its state of conation into a state of slumber and falls asleep.
Yeah,
right
I see this all the time with my cats.
Yeah.
They eat, they're finished hunting for the day.
Yep.
They've been out in the sun walking around the neighborhood. Then they come back home and they don't want to read a book. They fall asleep. They get mad at me if I don't get them up to bed soon enough.
Precisely, and I have to tell you, human beings don't do that at all.
No.
When we run out of biological opportunities and dangers, we think about things that are, truths that we don't yet get, questions that we have not yet answered. We think about love, and we think about why we're not getting a perfect enough version of love. We think about justice and goodness, and why we've been treated unjustly, or why the institutions of the world are unjust. We think about beauty, and we're not beautiful enough, and everybody else is not beautiful enough. The garden's not beautiful enough. The house is not beautiful enough. The museum is not beautiful enough. The mountain's not beautiful. And of course, we think that we're not at home. We're not yet at home here. And we know, we see these things, that take place in human beings. There's something about our transcend. What's the source of our desire for perfect, unconditional truth, love, goodness, and beauty and being? It has to be a source commensurate with what we desire, what we're aware of, namely perfect truth itself, perfect love itself, perfect beauty itself, perfect goodness and justice itself, perfect home itself, i.e. God. I mean, there's transcendence writ large all over us. But we have a way, and we can actually show the evidence of these near-death experiences. I mean, how are you going to explain that 80% of blind people see, most of them, for the first time when they're clinically dead? They're flat out in an operating room. Flat EEG. There's no electroencephalogram. There's no real electrical activity going on in the cerebral cortex. Right. No gag reflex. Fixed and dilated pupils. So there's very little electrical activity in the lower brain. And for the first time, right, the spiritual body sort of a thing leaves their physical body, is hovering above their physical body, and they can see everything that's going on around them for the first time. Blind people. And there's veridical data that can be verified after the fact about what they have seen for the first time. Clinically dead, no electrical activity in the brain, they're seeing for the first time. Pray tell, how is that possible? How are you going to explain that by narcotics, a lack of oxygen, the brain shutting down? The imagination, imagination requires that I have at least one moment of eyesight. How are you going to visually imagine something when you've never had any vision in your life? Unless you're seeing it now. I mean, just my one thought is, hey, where's all the veridical? Thousands of cases of veridical data verified after the fact. There's a tennis shoe sitting out there on the third floor ledge, of a hospital. The lady says, when I left my body, I just went out there and I was hovering around outside the hospital, and there's a tennis shoe out there with a very worn left toe there, and the shoelace is tucked underneath the heel. And I'm not kidding you, it's out there. It's probably been out there for the last 20 years. Nobody's just seen it. Probably dropped by a construction worker. So this gal, Dr. Kimberly Clark, she crawls out on the ledge there of the hospital. There's the shoe, precisely as stated. Go figure. Hey, Mr. So-and-so, did you know we lost your dentures? Oh, no, you didn't. When I was dead, clinically dead there, and I left my body, I saw the red-haired nurse take the dentures out of my mouth before they put the machine on me, open up a drawer under a machine that looks just like this and throw the dentures in, slam the drawer. If you look under that machine, you're going to find it. Sure enough, there.
And these are blind folks who, when they are clinically dead, see for the first time. And you can't explain that by mere physical realities or something that could have been before. They were blind. Yeah. And then they see that this, along with many other things, points to that there is something beyond this life. But I also have to point to something else. There is an end of the time. We have to take a break because you crave time. You have this perfection of time that you would like. But right now you get the limit. So we're taking a break. We'll be back in 2 minutes. I want to get your questions and comments. So please stay with us. Thank you and welcome back. First of all, I'd like to invite you to come and join us. If you can make a pilgrimage down here to EWTN, we'd love to have you. You can contact our pilgrimage department by calling them at 205-271-2966, and they'll give you all kind of information about places to stay and places to go eat and scheduling of the programs, tours, masses, of course, directions up to Hansville. You can also go to the website, EWTN.com, and get some of that information. Also want to encourage you, if you can, to get some of Father Spitzer's writings. His books are available at Religious Catalog, which is EWTNreligiouscatalog.com. And he talks more slowly when he's writing a book. so we'll do that. So let's start to take a question. Let's start off with Diane. Hello, Diane.
Hello, Father Mitch.
Hi, where are you from?
California, Los Banos, California.
Great. And your
My question for you and Father Spitzer is, what advice can you two give to help us parents that have 20-something-year-old children in this generation that you're talking about with their virtues that they go against? And we don't want to condone the behavior, but if you go against them, you risk losing a relationship with them.
Do they give you much pushback when you try to correct their behavior?
Pardon me?
When you try to talk to your children about their behavior, do they give you a lot of pushback on that?
Oh, well, one does. We have two daughters.
Okay. So thank you, Diane. That's a great question. Father Spitzer, what would you do?
I think, three things are required. The first thing is I wouldn't impose things on people, especially if you have a kind of a tenuous relationship. And if you pushed it or you gave an edict or you kind of gave an ultimatum, I think that could actually be very harmful to the relationship. You can almost figure they know what you think already. So the other kind of recourse is the one that's been around for a long time in the Catholic Church, and that is to point out why it is prudent to be virtuous. And I think some of the best material, and in this new show we're doing on virtue, freedom, and faith, has it, our website, magicenter.com, has some of this material. But we go to the 7 deadly sins first. And we talk about...
what are some of those sins?
Pride, of course, is the worst, then envy, then anger, then greed, then lust, which would include everything from, sexual infidelity to pornography. Then there would be what's called sloth or inactivity and laziness. Yeah, and then finally, gluttony, drunkenness, or drugs, which would be the final one. And I went from the most spiritual to the most physical in my listing of them. But those things are very well-known, classical kind of deadly sins. Right. And what we do is, of course, they're in the Sermon on the Mount. I mean, Jesus talks about this extensively. And of course, it's in Christian teaching. But I think the better way that we've found when we're working with younger people is we go to literature. So, for example, we'll take Shakespeare. Shakespeare's good for all of the deadly sins, right?
He writes about them. Yeah. That's what makes a play interesting. Sinners. So Macbeth, but I mean, the great part about Shakespeare is he knows the darkness of which he speaks. Right. So Macbeth, of course, he's the master of pride, and he listens to these witches and so forth, and he thinks he's going to be king, and he's not going to let anything stand in his way. And his wife, Lady Macbeth, is even worse than he is, and of course they become so full of themselves and so full of their destiny, full of hubris, that of course at the end of the play,
we see everything begins to fall apart. They've lost all of their friends. They've done destruction to everybody and everything around them. I mean, this pride, this arrogance, this hubris, this narcissism, has kind of led them, derailed them so completely. They're in the darkness so completely that, of course, Lady Macbeth winds up, committing suicide. I mean, Macbeth himself is about to be run through by his best friend. He's gotten his country into a veritable war, right? And of course, he gives this last soliloquy, which is nothing more than despair tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, right? As he's talking about this, and finally the soliloquy winds up with, life is nothing more than a tale told by an idiot, filled with sound and fury, signifying nothing. Now that, young people can get this. And so you sort of say, hey, you think being a big shot, you think that's a really important thing? You ought to take a look maybe at Shakespeare, take a look at Victor Hugo, maybe take a look at Charles Dickens for a second, because these are all guys who are masters of the deadly sins and the compensating virtues that counteract those deadly sins as well.
So in other words, maybe start to use some literature as one way. For instance, you can buy DVDs of Macbeth.
Sure.
Or
you could just buy art, when the series is done, the Virtue of Freedom and Faith, and we go through every single one of them with the literary quotes. For anger, we take Prince Hamlet. For greed, of course, we take A Christmas Carol, good old Scrooge. For envy, of course, Iago and Othello, Shakespeare's Othello.
But this is going to be one type of teaching device.
That's
but
right.
also, one of the things that concerns me about Diane's question is that she becomes afraid of losing the relationship.
Yeah.
And at that point, the child is holding the parent emotionally hostage.
Yeah.
And that is unacceptable. And that would be one of the things that, I would also want to say to a child, is say, look, it depends. I don't know if they're living in the house. A lot of times they are in their 20s. If they are living in the house, then, at least my dad, gave us some options like follow my rules or don't let the door hit you in the backside on the way out. That my dad didn't mind taking those risks. But, I think if there's that fear, that must also be confronted. And let that child know, you do not hold me hostage here.
Yeah, if it's a
that
young
I
child,
am, well, it's even in the 20s. You don't say, I'm going to respect you.
Yeah.
But I also demand that you respect me. This is something that I won't put up with. And if that is not acceptable, then you do need to leave. And maybe breaking the relationship and letting them see the consequences is a necessary step, especially if they're using drugs and things like that. For sure, then you have to do what they call tough love. And that's very important too.
I think it's equally important too, though, to point out the darkness in the deadly sins.
Yep.
And of course, I think in this culture, lust is a huge one. I think it needs to be dealt with. I think pride is over the top in this culture.
Well, yeah, it takes the form of narcissism here.
Oh, yes, absolutely it does. And I think, again, to point out the darkness in it, whether we do it from the vantage point of psychology, whether we do it from the vantage point of literature, right? And there's so much material to do it with. But eventually, I work my way up to the Bible. Normally, with a kid who's kind of in rebellion, if I try and just put out a scripture quote right away, I mean, just, they don't want to hear it because they're already culturally conditioned to reject it,
Right.
And so I just say, well, let's just start looking at the darkness. And I work my way up to the darkness of being without religion. And I worked my way up to the darkness of alienating yourself from God, the darkness of alienating yourself from everybody else. And then when you finally get to the point where you're just mired in the emptiness that results, right? The out brief candle of Macbeth, right? You're finally at the point of the emptiness of your own arrogance and narcissism. Where will you turn when you've rejected God, when you've rejected everybody? They'll, of course, accept you back, but of course, you won't think that you will be acceptable. And that's why Macbeth himself is going to succumb to despair, and of course you could just see this again and again in all forms of literature. I mean,
well, as a matter of fact, I would say that the dominant form of humor in today's culture is to see scenarios of narcissistic egomaniacs being the whole source of that. That's true of Big Bang Theory. It's true in Friends, and you just go right on down the line. Will and Grace. I mean, all these comedies were about narcissistic egomaniacs. Seinfeld, etc. And maybe you can. Not all of them know Shakespeare, but they know Friends. They watch the reruns. Let's take another caller. Sure. Hello, Joyce.
Hi, Father.
Hi. Where are you from?
I'm from North Carolina.
Great. And your question?
Yes, I was just wondering how we can get back to back in line with God's love. It seems like at the workplace, it has just become so robotic. It's like no one really has a heart when someone calls out. It's like the bottom dollar. It's like money is everything. I think that society itself is just getting tired of the corporate world, and they kind of want to go back to that mom and pop's place of working. It just seems like there was a little bit more love and family, but I was just wondering if he had any ideas about, how to wake up people. It's just like you already know what they're going to do before they do it, and then if you do complain, then it's like you have a bad attitude, and, you just want to wake them up. You want to help them, but I've just noticed this, and I just wondered if he had any good ideas on how to get with God's love, and you want to smile, you want a good attitude, you want a happy place to work, but you just see people just doing what they're doing. It's so sad sometimes.
All right. So here we have, as soon as she's in a corporate situation where people are just going through whatever work they're doing, trying to get what they can for themselves, and the social component is basically run by Scrooge.
Right. I mean, first of all, there's literature, coming right off the floor practically, that it says that businesses that do have a heart, that do encourage some degree of camaraderie, they're always going to have more common cause. In my levels of happiness that I just alluded to earlier, basically level 3 and level 4 businesses, those that are contributive, empathetic, encourage people to be, human in her sense, in the caller's sense, those businesses are more successful. They really do have more common cause than businesses that do not have them. They also don't have what we call debilitating factors, that are, undermining the morale of people all the time, which, results in passive aggressiveness and aggressive defensiveness. And these things are really highly problematic, things. And so there's all kinds of literature. In fact, there's schools of leadership, like servant leadership, and many others that are encouraging level 3 and level 4 cultures within an organization that do allow for some sense of empathy, of love, of friendship, of decency, of respect for other people, and do not do the contrary. And by the way, Deming's quality models are very interesting.
Who's Deming?
He is kind of the father of quality, and quality building and so forth within
in business.
In business,
Okay.
Exactly, and very very well known. Dr. Deming. In terms of positioning not just American but Japanese industries as high quality industries. But anyway, he said, what do you need in order to have high quality within an organization? You're always going to have people who are attentive to the needs of the customer. You're always going to have improvement in your processes. You're always going to have to eliminate waste, and you're always going to have to eliminate product defects. Now, if you look at those four things, how are you going to do that if people don't tell you information? How are you going to do that if you don't have good teams? But how are you going to have good teams unless the morale is there, unless the defensiveness within the environment is evaporated? How are you going to have people telling? If people are passive aggressive, I mean, they'll never tell you anything that's good for you. Right. As a matter of fact, they'll sink it right to the bottom of the list. So when you kind of go through it and you say, hey, what kind of a culture do you want in business? What you want in business is a culture that very much will promote what we call constructive, behaviors. Those will produce affiliative behaviors where people will volunteer and come onto teams. I have a book on this called Spirit of Leadership, and in there's a whole justification for why you really want to have not just a virtuous company, but a company that's what I call contributive and empathetic, a culture that's contributive and empathetic. And that book's called Spirit of Leadership.
Yeah, and that's something that you need in business. Mm-hmm. We see the disastrous lack of it mm-hmm. in government, where mm-hmm. The Veterans Administration, people are worried about bonuses and letting sick people wait and listen until they die. So that's that lack of care, yeah. mm-hmm. and that's not something that President Obama can make happen. This has to happen yeah. at all the levels. I mean, yeah. He said he's just finding out about it in the news. I mean, he can't know that stuff, but mm-hmm. the people who are there have to say, look, the veterans yeah. need the care. That's the reaction of the American people. You serve the people. Make sure you care for them, and that concern for them has to go at every level, in each individual in the business or the government mm-hmm. has to be about that.
Yeah, there's a fellow named Greenleaf who has written extensively about this, called servant leadership.
Yeah. Let's take another caller. Hello, Chuck.
Hello.
Hi, where are you from?
Republic of Texas.
Ain't you something? I like this guy better already.
Republic of Texas.
Yes, sir. What is your question, Chuck?
Okay, and you or Father Spitzer can answer. With the current philosophy of material or moral relativism, and it seems to be taking hold in a lot of the Catholics who consider themselves good Catholics, go to communion and church, etc. But when it comes down to talking about intrinsic evils such as abortion or euthanasia or homosexual activity, they don't see anything wrong with it. They say you got to follow your conscience. How would you answer a person like that?
Chuck, that is a great question and a big problem.
Yeah, I think conscience has to be informed by objective principles. And let me repeat that. Conscience has to be informed by objective principles.
It's not about emotions.
It's not about emotions, and the devil can work through, feelings that seem, right? If you think that you can feel your way, and a lot of times people use the term conscience, to refer to feelings. I felt good about killing Joe. I think it's okay. Yeah. And of course, that's not conscience. Conscience is this great gift that we have been given, a most misused term. But conscience is this great power, intuitive power within us that knows, and senses the presence of evil as evil. And he used the word intrinsic evil, and senses the presence of good as good. And it's attracted to the good, and it's horrified by evil. It's scared of evil. It's alienated by evil. Now that's what conscience is. But conscience itself, right, needs to be informed. It needs to have objective principles given to it so that it can be more nuanced. I mean, of course, people in their conscience know without a lot of information, murder is bad. You really, right, tick-tock of, Edgar Allan Poe's Telltale Heart, right? Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky, right? People know that murder is wrong. You murder somebody, your conscience is going to really disturb you for a long time. But then, of course, you know that being dishonest, inauthentic, and lying, that's going to alienate, not as much as murder would alienate you, stealing something that really doesn't belong to you. You get used to it after a while if you wanted to, but eventually, at first when it starts, it's going to alienate you, so forth and so on. But when you get past what you call maybe the big 5 or 6, rules, don't cheat, don't lie, don't steal, don't harm unnecessarily, don't harm somebody else's reputation, right? Don't disturb somebody else's marriage and so forth. So you get beyond the big ones, and all of a sudden there's a lot of nuance there, and we need the help of principles. We desperately need teaching that will help us to inform our conscience, to get it more specific and more nuanced. And of course, when somebody says, follow your conscience, but in the same breath doesn't acknowledge that conscience really does know the difference between good and evil, and doesn't know that conscience requires objective principles in order to inform it, they're not talking about conscience like you're talking about conscience. They're talking just about a bunch of feelings. And feelings, I call it the Spitzerian principle of rationalization. Give me 5 minutes, and in my own self-interest, I can find 100 rationales for doing something evil if I don't want to follow my conscience and principle. Absolute feelings can be utterly deceiving. And people mix up the word, mix up conscience. It's just a word to them. This powerful force that we have within us. They mix it up with feelings and random intuitions that are manifest in self-interest.
It's something that I think you also have to push them a bit on. Usually, they don't mind a relativistic application of morals to other people. But if you start to apply relativistic morality to them, then they might react. For instance, well, you're in favor of abortion. What if I'm in favor of aborting you now, even though you're 50 years old? But I think, well, they waited too late, and I'd just go ahead and kill you now. On what principle would you be able to convince me that I should not abort you now that you're 50 years out of the womb?
Yeah, no, exactly.
So what is there about you that makes that so important? Or what is there about your automobile that if I feel in my conscience I should have it? What principle would you have to convince me not to pull out a gun, force you to give me the keys, and then drive away with your car?
Precisely. And here's what you point out is what's called the silver rule, which we call ethical minimalism, right? So this is the one with the knots. Jesus took the knots out and made it ethical maximalism. That's the golden rule. But the silver rule is do not do unto others what you would not have them do unto you. Don't do a harm to others that you don't want done to you.
Right.
So if you expect X to happen, not to be done. So if you expect not to be killed on sight, you shouldn't be killing people on sight either. And even Thomas Hobbes, a person of strict utilitarian credentials, basically said, without the silver rule, without ethical minimalism, which, by the way, is in every religion, in every culture,
Every civilization.
Every civilization.
Even without religion.
Even without religion. Every single one. Even Hobbes said life would be brutish, ugly, and short.
Right.
I mean, essentially, we have to have it, if not just out of the sense of the most basic kind of justice, you have to have it for the preservation of society and civilization.
Right.
So you're absolutely right. Moral relativism cannot even sustain the silver rule. I mean, basically, if you're a pure relativist, the silver rule's out the window. If
Right,
the
because
silver
you have
rule's
no
out the window-
basis.
That's right.
But we
Yeah.
also dealing with objective reality. We have run out of time. And that's not relative. So,
May I
thank you
mention
for
my
being here.
website?
And if you would join me in giving a blessing,
I would do
may
so.
Almighty God bless you and keep you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. If you want to learn more about Magis, the website is
MagisCenter.com, where you'll find...
MagisCenter.com. And we also want to remind you that this network is brought to you by you. We can do Father Spitzer's new series, have him and all the other guests here, because you make it possible. So please remember to keep us in between your gas bill, your electric bill, and your cable bill, especially during the summer months when a lot of people go away, because our bill collectors don't go away. Thank you.